In aviation archaeology, the most dangerous variable is usually the environment itself. Salt water can eat into aluminum surprisingly fast when protective coatings fail, and salt-laden moisture cycles in and out. Jungle humidity can rot organic components quickly. Ice can crush and distort wreckage as glaciers creep and grind. But in the deep western desert of Egypt, decay can slow to a crawl, and time leaves fewer fingerprints. On June 28, 1942, a Royal Air Force P-40 Kittyhawk, serial number ET574, failed to return from a ferry flight. Records indicate the pilot, Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping, was moving the aircraft toward a repair depot with a landing gear problem and possibly flak damage when he became lost over the western desert. Somewhere beyond the last navigational point, the aircraft dropped out of the operational roster and into the blank spaces of the map. 70 years later, in early 2012, a survey team working in Egypt's El Wadi El Gadid region crossed a dune line and found the aircraft resting in the sand. It was roughly 200 miles from the nearest settlement. The tires were flat, the fabric-covered control surfaces were gone, and the glazing was sandblasted and crazed by decades of sun and wind. Yet the airframe was still remarkably intact, less a wreckage field than a single, forced-landed machine parked by accident in the wrong century. This is the case of Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping and the Sahara time capsule. The objective is to read the static evidence of a machine that waited 70 years for a recovery team that never arrived. The discovery of the Kittyhawk presents a rare forensic condition known as in situ context. In a standard crash investigation, the site is often compromised by fire, high-energy impact forces, or immediate salvage efforts by local populations. An in situ site preserves the exact geometric relationship between the machine, the debris field, and the surrounding terrain as they settled at the moment of the event. For decades, this site appears to have seen little human disturbance. No organized recovery effort reached it, and there are no signs of systematic stripping in the earliest photos. That isolation transforms the wreck from a simple crash site into a historical document. Switch positions, broken edges, and the quiet geometry of scattered parts can still be read, carefully as clues that survived heat, wind, and time. The aircraft is a QRTS Kittyhawk Mark I, the export form of the American P-40E Warhawk, built rugged for desert war. The landing gear problem is central to this story. P-40 emergency instructions allowed gear-down landings only if a suitable field was available. If not, pilots were advised to keep the gear up and belly in. Here, the record and the damage patterns point to a cruel constraint. The undercarriage would not retract, and when the pilot tried to arrive on wheels in soft sand, the landing tore the gear away instead of letting it roll. The fuselage still reads like alclad, a corrosion-resistant skin that, in the hyper-arid western desert, can outlast decades with minimal pitting. With humidity driven low and salt-laden moisture largely absent, the metal had time on its side, even if chemistry never truly stops. However, the preservation is not uniform. The metal endured, but the softer parts paid the price. Decades of ultraviolet light broke down the dope and fabric until the rudder, elevators, and ailerons were left as bare metal frames. Inside the wings, the ammunition trays tell another part of the story. The .50 caliber guns still carried their belts, and some rounds appear remarkably clean in early documentation. That does not prove the aircraft never faced fire, but it does fit a non-combat loss, a ferry flight, a mechanical problem, and a forced landing that ended before the pilot ever had a reason or a chance to shoot. The canopy and cockpit glazing are heavily weathered, sand-blasted, crazed, and opaque in the earliest images. The cockpit itself is empty. There are no human remains inside the fuselage. The seat and harness hardware remain, but the pilot is not there. The initial survey establishes 3 grounded points. First, the aircraft can be linked to ET574 through surviving markings reported in early documentation. Second, it made a survivable forced landing rather than a high-energy disintegration. The airframe remained largely together even if the undercarriage and propeller unit were torn away. Third, objects found outside the aircraft, especially the parachute and radio components described by early observers, suggest the pilot survived long enough to act, even though his ultimate fate remains unconfirmed. We have the machine. It is sitting in the middle of nowhere, perfectly preserved, waiting to be read. But a recovery operation cannot focus solely on the hardware. The absence of the pilot creates a forensic gap. The aircraft is the anchor, but the story has moved. We know he landed. We know he opened the canopy. The question now shifts to the decisions he made when he stepped out onto the sand. It starts with the wheels. Stuck down, they rewrite the math of range. On a long ferry flight over hostile terrain, a pilot retracts the landing gear because every knot of drag costs miles. With the wheels left hanging, the struts and tires become air brakes, parasitic drag that has nothing to do with lift, only resistance. The cure is power, and power costs fuel. Hold cruise and ground speed falls, push the throttle and consumption climbs. Either way, the range collapses. For ET-574, a hydraulic failure or mechanical jam likely locked the gear down, forcing a high drag profile across a desert with few landmarks. This constraint forces a decision. He can turn back, or he can press on and hope to reach the maintenance depot before his tanks run dry. The evidence suggests he continued until he became disoriented or ran low on fuel. When the engine finally quit, the wheels were still down. And in soft sand, they could either roll or bite. He held the tail low and touched down, but the main legs dug in and the aircraft decelerated brutally. The struts took the load long enough to keep the airframe together, then the nose pitched down hard. The propeller struck the sand while the engine was still rotating. In a P-40, the propeller is driven through a reduction gear, and a sudden prop strike can overload that structure. Early accounts describe the reduction gear housing failing and the propeller unit separating and being thrown clear. What matters for the story is the result. The aircraft absorbed the landing without breaking into pieces, leaving a single airframe and a readable scene. After the landing, the desert takes over, hard light, abrasive wind, and chemistry that moves slowly but never stops. The skin of the P-40 is made of alclad aluminum. This is a composite sheet material. The core is a high-strength aluminum alloy, which is strong but prone to corrosion. This core is sandwiched between two thin layers of pure aluminum. Pure aluminum reacts with oxygen to form a microscopic hard oxide layer that seals the metal from further decay. In a salt air environment, this layer can be breached. In the bone-dry air of Egypt, the oxide layer became a permanent shield. However, the sun was merciless to the organic components. The control surfaces on the tail and wings were covered in doped fabric, not metal. Ultraviolet radiation attacks the chemical bonds of the dope and the cotton fibers. Over 70 years, the sun burned the fabric into dust, leaving only the metal ribs of the rudder and elevators exposed like a skeleton. The .50 caliber guns in the wings were protected by the metal skin, and ammunition was still present in early documentation. But any decades-old ordnance is inherently unpredictable. In fact, early reporting noted that authorities removed the ammunition for safety, because stable is never a guarantee when time and heat have had 70 years to work. The aircraft survived the landing and the decades of exposure. It sits on the sand, a hardened aluminum shell. But for the pilot, the cessation of movement was not the end of the danger. The separation of the propeller and the silence of the engine marked the transition from a mechanical crisis to a physiological one. The cockpit was intact, but it was now a stationary greenhouse rapidly heating under the midday sun. The most critical evidence at the site was not the condition of the metal skin, but the pattern on the sand. What was moved, what was opened, what was placed. In a high-energy impact, physics scatters everything and leaves it where momentum dictates. Here, the investigation looks for the opposite. Objects that don't belong where they should, arrangements that read like intention. That kind of order is a signature, proof of survival, mobility, and decision-making after the aircraft stopped moving. The first anomaly was the parachute. In a standard bailout, the canopy and harness would be absent from the airframe. In a fatal crash where the pilot remains in the cockpit, the parachute acts as a seat cushion and remains strapped to the body. Here, the parachute was found outside the aircraft. The silk canopy had been deployed, but not for flight. At least one early observer argued it may have been used as shade against the sun. That does not let us diagnose injuries from a photograph, but it does suggest the pilot survived the landing and remained mobile long enough to try to improve his odds. The second anomaly was the radio. In a P-40, the communication set sits behind the pilot's seat. Reaching it means opening panels and wrestling heavy wiring. Yet the transmitter and receiver were on the sand, not in the fuselage, with the aircraft battery beside them, equipment that takes time and effort to extract in heat and stress. Set apart like this, the pieces read as a disciplined attempt to make contact. power the set outside the airframe, improvise a signal, get any reply at all. The presence of these heavy items on the sand proves cognitive function. The pilot was following a mental checklist. He secured shelter. He attempted to restore communications. He accessed the survival kit. The gun bays in the wings were also found open, suggesting he may have checked the ammunition or removed the guns to lighten the airframe, though the .50 caliber rounds remained in the belts. The forensic context tells us that he did not leave immediately. He stayed with the machine as training dictated. He utilized the resources available to him. The shelter proves he prepared for the heat. The radio proves he tried to call for help. But the static evidence also reveals the final decision. The shelter was eventually abandoned. The radio was left on the sand. The battery was disconnected. At some point, the pilot calculated that no rescue was coming. The site offered shade, but it offered no water. The forensic trail ends at the edge of the debris field. The aircraft remained, preserved by the dry air. The pilot, having exhausted his mechanical options, made the decision to walk into the open desert. When photographs of the aircraft surfaced online, the desert's isolation stopped protecting it. In the digital age, an image can function like a beacon, drawing attention to places that survived precisely because no one was looking. Early reporting and later commentary described vandalism and stripping soon after the discovery became known, raising an urgent question. Could anyone secure the site before the story was destroyed by visitors? The consequences of this exposure were immediate. The pristine condition of the cockpit glass, which had survived decades of solar radiation, was destroyed. The canopy was smashed with heavy objects to gain access to the interior. The .50 caliber ammunition belts, which had remained stable in the wing bays since 1942, were stripped out. The instrument panel was hammered in an attempt to pry out gauges. Perhaps the most confusing damage to the untrained eye appeared on the fuselage skin. Jagged holes and torn metal near the markings could be mistaken for wartime hits, but the safer reading, supported by the broader pattern of post-discovery destruction, is that this was later vandalism, not evidence of the fight that brought the aircraft down. The site began to degrade rapidly. The forensic context, the subtle arrangement of the parachute and the battery was being trampled. Pressure to secure the aircraft grew as soon as vandalism was reported. Contemporary accounts describe the RAF museum working through diplomatic and local channels and engaging Kennett Aviation to help safeguard the airframe. The result was not a forensic excavation, but a rapid protective recovery. The Kittyhawk was removed from the open desert and placed into storage for safekeeping at El Al-Umain. This process, while necessary to save the metal from further vandalism, severed the chain of custody regarding the site itself. In a forensic recovery, the soil is sifted. The exact position of every rivet and casing is mapped to a grid. The relationship between the detached propeller hub and the engine block is measured to the inch to calculate impact vectors. When the crane lifted the P-40, that data was left behind. The aircraft was secured on the truck bed, lashed down with chains, and driven out of the dunes. It traveled hundreds of miles to a storage facility far from the silence of the crash site. The immediate threat of total destruction was neutralized. The aluminum was safe from random gunfire and hammer blows. But the context was gone. The aircraft was no longer a crash site. It was now a collection of parts on a pallet. The story of the pilot's survival, written in the placement of the rocks and the silk, was erased by the tracks of the recovery vehicles. The machine had been saved, but it was about to undergo a transformation that would challenge the definition of preservation. It was moved to a workshop environment where the priority was not historical accuracy, but public display. The sand was washed away, and with it, the patina of the Desert War. When a recovered aircraft arrives at a facility, the engineering team faces a binary decision. The first option is conservation. This process stabilizes the artifact in its current state, halting corrosion but preserving every dent, tear, and fade mark as part of the historical record. The second option is restoration. This process attempts to reverse time, replacing damaged components and applying new paint to simulate the condition of the machine before the accident. For the Sahara P-40, the decision was made to pursue aggressive cosmetic restoration. This choice prioritized the visual appearance of a complete aircraft over the preservation of forensic integrity. The result was a fundamental alteration of the artifact. The most immediate casualty of this process was the original surface of the airframe. The desert-worn skin carried the story in its abrasions, stains, and surviving traces of wartime finish. Once the aircraft was cleaned and repainted for display, much of that as found surface was inevitably lost, along with fragile remnants of markings that linked the machine to 260 Squadron's code HS and the aircraft letter B. Following the repaint, the aircraft gained markings that made it look more like a generic desert P-40 than the specific airframe that disappeared in 1942. Most striking was the addition of shark teeth and eyes, motifs famously associated with RAF Kittyhawks of 112 Squadron, not 260 Squadron. The symbol may draw crowds, but it blurs identity. It turns ET-574 into an icon instead of a name. The landing gear presentation also changed. Later photographs and commentary note that non-original wheels were fitted, truck wheels used as a substitute for aircraft tires. Even if the intention was simply to make the airframe stand for display, substitutions like this alter stance and erase subtle clues that matter to a forensic reading of the landing. With each substituted part, the chain of custody phrase. In forensic engineering, that chain is the documented path from scene to display, proof that what you are looking at is what was found, not what was later improved. When a restoration team fills holes with fiberglass body filler and paints over stress fractures, they aren't just cleaning up an artifact. They are burying the very data points that explain the crash. The aircraft now sitting on display is physically the same structure that crashed in 1942, but the story written on its skin has been overwritten. The crash damage, which detailed the energy of the impact, is hidden under Bondo and gloss paint. The survival evidence, the specific wear patterns on the cockpit combing where the pilot climbed out, is gone. Behind barriers and guards, the airframe is protected from looters and casual destruction. But it has also been muted. Restoration converted a singular archaeological discovery into a generic static display, shifting the focus from the man who flew it to the metal he left behind. And even with the aircraft safe in public view, the final chapter of the pilot's journey remains outside the museum walls. The recovery of the airframe solved the mystery of the machine, but it left the status of the operator unresolved. The P-40 sits in the El Umain Military Museum, repainted and reconfigured, serving as a generic monument to the Desert War. However, the specific history of Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping does not end at the museum display barrier. It ends in the open desert, where the forensic trail goes cold. While the aircraft was being secured for transport, a separate search was conducted to locate the pilot. The logic of the grid followed the survival evidence left at the site. A shelter made, a radio worked, then the hull abandoned. The question was a vector. Which direction did he walk and how far did he get? An independent search team later reported finding human remains a few miles from the crash site. The proximity is haunting, but proximity is not identity. Without a confirmed forensic link, the remains cannot be presented as definitively belonging to Flight Sergeant Copping, only as a lead that deepened the mystery instead of closing it. The condition of any remains in the western desert can be shaped by heat, wind, ultraviolet exposure, and time, forces that destroy textiles and leather and can leave little behind. But human identification is not a metaphor. The desert can preserve metal and still erase a person so completely that only formal forensic work can speak with authority. The discovery of remains could have closed the case, if identification was possible. In a written answer from the UK Ministry of Defence, officials stated that rigorous DNA tests undertaken by Egyptian authorities at Britain's request were unable to obtain viable DNA samples because of the age and degradation of the remains, and that there were no plans for new tests. The result is a story with strong circumstantial gravity, but no public forensic confirmation. The outcome of the recovery operation is a partial success. The aircraft was saved from total destruction by looters, but it was compromised by a restoration that prioritized aesthetics over history. The pilot was located, but his return is caught in an administrative deadlock. The Sahara time capsule has been opened, and in the process, much of what it preserved was overwritten. The silence of the desert has been replaced by the noise of a tourist hall. But the photograph of the aircraft as it was found, sitting alone on the hard-packed sand with its nose to the wind, remains the definitive record. It captures the moment where the machine stopped and the pilot made his final decision. Evidence suggests he did not die in the impact. He likely executed a survivable forced landing, used what he had, and tried to improve his chances. Shelter, signals, some plan written into the sand beside the airplane. but the last miles of Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping remain unconfirmed. The aircraft is secure. The story of the man is still out there, somewhere beyond the edge of the debris field.